Hi, I'm Dr. Roger Cohen, and I would like to welcome you to this lecture. We are going to be talking about justice, violence, and deception found in the story of the rape of Dinah in Genesis 34. And I've titled this A Jewish Ethical Analysis of the Rape of Dinah in Genesis 34. I would argue that this is the single most ethically uncomfortable passage in the entire Pentateuch. The first phrase is the biblical word for rape that we see on the slide here. And it's defined not as seduction, not as ambiguity. The Hebrew root means to oppress, to afflict, to humble by force. And the Torah uses it without a euphemism. The second phrase in Hebrew that I have is the brother's final anguished question: should our sister be treated like a prostitute? Is the last line of the chapter, and in the story it goes unanswered. That silence, the unanswered question, is in many ways the subject of our entire lecture. Genesis 34 raises questions that run straight to the center of Jewish moral thought. How must a community respond to sexual violence? When is violent retaliation just? When does it become atrocity? What happens when you weaponize something sacred? And perhaps most urgently, whose voice are we hearing and whose voice is missing in the stories? We're going to work through this narrative carefully, methodologically, honestly, and we will draw on the Talmud, on Maimonides, on Rashi, and the best of contemporary Jewish thinkers from the feminist theology world today, and will not resolve every question because the tradition itself does not. But we will understand the debate more deeply than we did when we walked into this debate. On the roadmap, you'll see 7 major sections that we'll go through today. And we'll start with the text itself in the Hebrew because it's the tradition and the precise words that are being said. And then we'll end with a synthesis of the framework. So let's begin with Genesis 34. In Genesis 34, it opens with a deceptive simplicity. One verse that says, Dinah, daughter of Leah and Jacob, goes out to visit the daughters of the land. And that's it. One sentence, no fanfare, no warning, no divine intervention. She simply goes out. And immediately in the very next sentence, Shechem, son of the local prince Hamor, sees her, takes her, and rapes her. The Hebrew word is stark. He afflicted her. What follows in a 4-act drama, and you can see, is these 4 words on your screen now. And the first section of the story, I will call it Act 1, is the violation. Shechem rapes Dinah. And then the text tells us his soul cleaves to her. He loves her. The text says he asked his father to get her for him a wife. And this juxtaposition, rape followed immediately by declarations of love and desire for marriage, has troubled readers for many millennia, but we'll come back to this. The second act, or the negotiation, is Hamor approaches Jacob. Jacob's sons return from the field and learn what happened. The story tells us they were grieved, outraged, and they considered it a disgrace done against Israel. They respond to Hamor's marriage proposal with what the narrator himself calls deceit. They demand that all the men of Shechem be circumcised. Third act, or part of the story, we call the massacre. On the third day, while the men of Shechem were incapacitated after their post-surgical pain of circumcision, Simon and Levi take their swords and kill every single male in the city. Every one. Then the other brothers plunder the city, take the women and children, take all the wealth and livestock. Then in Act 4, there's rebuke. Jacob is furious. Or at least he says he is. His rebuke focuses tellingly on the danger his family now faces. The Canaanites will unite against us, he says in the text. And we are few in number, we will be destroyed. and the brothers reply the unanswered question, should our sister be treated like a prostitute? Notice what the Torah does not tell us. We have no divine commentary, no angel appearing to condemn Simon or Levi or to vindicate them. No plagues fall. No blessing is given. Chapter simply ends with a question. This is, I would argue, deliberate. The Torah is not forgetting to render a verdict, it is trusting, demanding that we will render it ourselves when we're retelling or reading the story. So there are a few phrases within the verses, a few verses that we need to look at. And before we do ethics, we need to understand the word narrative and the words the Torah chooses and the words that it avoids are themselves moral statements within the text. So let's look at 5 key terms in this chapter. The first word you'll see on the screen in verse 34, verse 2, is the word for afflicted or humbled her. This is the word for rape in Hebrew. It has a root of ein, nun, and he, meaning to oppress, to afflict, to degrade. It appears in 2 Samuel 13:14, where Amnon rapes his half-sister Tamar as well. It appears in Deuteronomy 22 in the laws concerning sexual violation. There's no ambiguity in the tradition about what this verb means. It's not seduction. It's not a gray area. The Torah uses the language of oppression, affliction, and it uses the language of power and abuse. The second word, nevlah, found in 34:7, says the brothers call to what happened to Dinah a nevlah, a term for extraordinary moral gravity. You'll find it in the story of Levite's concubine in Gibeah, one of the darkest episodes in Judges. You'll find it wherever the Bible wants to signal a crime that doesn't just break a law, but tears the moral fabric of the community. It's not a personal injury, it's a communal wound. The third word that is worth looking at is mirmah, found in 34:13, which is this is the narrator's own words in the story for the brother's pain. It's not the character's characterization, the text's own moral label. The Torah does not often editorialize. When it does, we should pay attention. Mirmah is not the same. Mirmah is the same root word used when Jacob deceives his father Isaac. It's not a neutral word. The narrator is telling us before the massacre even happens that what the brothers are doing is treacherous. Then there's the word or sword. It's used to describe the total annihilation of every male in Shechem. Every one. Not just Shechem, not Hamor, every man in the city. The word appears twice in verses 25 and 26 to emphasize the complete killing. And the final word that is worth looking at, found in verse 34-31, is the word kazona, meaning like a prostitute. The brothers question, in the biblical world, to call something kazona, treating like a woman like a prostitute, means treating her as if she had no honor worth protecting, no family worth avenging, no dignity worth defending. The brothers are saying, Dinah has a family, Dinah has honor, and they will not stand by while it is denied. Whether their response was right is what we are examining right now. So this brings us to looking at the acts of sexual violence itself. And in this, we'll look at oneness, the legal category. Jewish law is a precise term for what happened to Dinah. Oneness. The compulsion, duress, or violation by force. And the governing principle of this is absolute. The Torah exempts one who acts under compulsion. The victim of rape bears zero legal or moral culpability. Zero. This is not modern innovation. It is the clear ruling of the Babylonian Talmud tractate, Yom Avot, 53b. The victim is not to be owning the victimization. So I want to stop and kind of let that set in even further. There's a tradition of commentary most famously associated with reading of Rashi that we'll look at shortly that finds something to criticize Dinah's going out in the first place. The tradition has been used wrongly, and sometimes other traditions will say that Dinah's at fault for going out, and that somehow Dinah brought this upon herself. But it must be rejected. This ownership of it of Dinah is not Dinah's responsibility, and full stop. It must be not seen as a valid exemption or category for Dinah. It's not Dinah's fault for going out. The second category here is the second principle is the idea of human dignity. This is one of the most fundamental and foundational concepts in Jewish ethics. Talmud Hilkhot 19b says that that it's so serious that it can override rabbinic prohibitions, human dignity, and the tradition does not often say that. So when it does, when tradition is telling us this, there must be an extraordinary weight it assigns to human dignity in any situation. So rape is a violation of human dignity in the most complete sense because it attacks the body, the autonomy, the selfhood of another person. And in Jewish ethics, this is not merely a legal infraction. It's an assault on the image of God in which every human being is created. The third category here worth talking out is the Noahide law. So before we look at Dinah herself, Genesis 34 takes place before Sinai, before the Torah is given on the mountain, and the specific laws of Leviticus and Deuteronomy do not apply in this framework. And what applies to the framework of the 7 Noahide laws, and the 7 Noahide laws hold that all humanity is bound by them from the time of Noah. And one of those is the prohibition against sexual immorality. That includes rape. So Maimonides in Mishneh Torah lists this explicitly. This matters for how we assess the guilt, not only of Shechem, but for the entire city. And this is a question we have to return to discuss Simeon and Levi. So now let's look at Dinah. And if we'll look at the silence of Dinah, and we'll see that 4 commentators, 4 interpretations of the same basic fact. Dinah speaks no words in this chapter. No, she doesn't say a single word. She appears in verse 1, and she's taken in verse 2. She's retrieved in verse 26. She's never heard from. So let's look at some of these readings. Rashi in the 11th century comments on Dinah's going out in verse 1 by calling her a person who goes out with an implicit suggestion for improper boldness. He connects her to her mother Leah, who is in Genesis 30 also went out. Rashi is not necessarily blaming Dinah for the rape, but his comment has been used that way. It reflects a discomfort in the tradition with female agency in public spaces. Midrash Bereshit Rabbah imagines Dinah as someone who, after the rape, did not want to go home, who clung to Shechem's house because she feared facing her father. And this reading, whatever its intentions, locates the problem in Dinah's emotions rather than the community's failure to protect her. Nachmanides. This is not the Rambam in his best form. He's often the most uncomfortable commentator from the Middle Ages. Reads Dinah's silence as structural, and so this 13th century commentator is saying that the text is written from a patriarchal perspective, and the woman at the center of the story has been written out of it, and that Rambam doesn't apologize for this. He's just naming it as it is by saying she's not at fault. And then There's Frymer-Kensky in most recent times from more feminist theology that says the reading of the Bible book that argues that Dinah's voicelessness is not an accident of ancient storytelling. It's a deliberate literary device, one that mirrors and critiques a social structure in which moral energy is released by a woman's rape is channeled entirely into contests of male honor, while the woman herself disappears. So the moral agency of Dinah then becomes quite a question to which developed throughout time, and and brings us, as we're starting to look at now, what kind of moral agency did Dinah have? And this is evident with the silence of Jacob. If we look at the verse listed here, verse 5, Jacob hears that his daughter has been defiled. His sons were at the field, and the text tells us that Jacob kept silent. He held his peace. He waited. Now, is that silence admirable or damnable? The defense of Jacob is this, that Jacob waited for his sons, and he gathered his family before acting. And the tradition often reflects that the quality of deliberation, the accounting for the soul for action is important. It's consistent with Jacob's character throughout Genesis, and Jacob is the man of cunning, of patience, and of long-term strategy. He's not Esau. He's not like Esau also who acted from his gut. He waits, he calculates. And the reading says that waiting was the right move. But a critique of Jacob there is that it begins with the Hebrew itself from the root word of het reshin, which appears elsewhere in the Bible. And so in Numbers 30 also, a husband's silence in face of a vow made by his wife is treated as a legal consent. And the word vayit'anneha carries the weight of passivity as complicity. So the point being is that a critique of Jacob is that his silence is complicit to legal consent. But the Torah commands us in Leviticus 19:16, you shall not stand idly by the blood of your neighbor. And so this isn't counsel, it's a commandment. And Maimonides and Mishneh Torah also said that if you can save someone from harm, you do, and you do not act, you have violated a biblical prohibition. So Jacob did not just wait. He did nothing, and he raised no formal protest. He sought no legal redress. However limited that might have been, he did not publicly condemn what had been done to his daughter, and then his sons massacred the city, and he rebuked them on the grounds that they have endangered his safety. So this brings us to a critique or a problem then with his Jacob's response. Nachmanides is scathing in his point and says that Jacob should have led with the moral condemnation and followed it with a practical concern, not the reverse. And to make your first objection the danger to yourself after your daughter had been raped is moral failure. And it reveals what you were actually worried about. And here is the detail that I find most haunting in Genesis 49 on his deathbed. Jacob curses Simeon and Levi. He says from the JPS, cursed be their anger so fierce and their wrath so relentless. He condemns their violence. But he never, not once in the entire text, condemns the rape of Dinah. He never says Shechem was wrong. He never mourns his daughter's suffering. His moral concern seems entirely focused on the political and strategic consequences of his son's response. So there is a case for the retaliation of Simeon and Levi, and there is a case for the brothers. So let's begin with the strongest possible defense of Simeon and Levi because it's often underestimated. First, the blood avenger. This is not a fringe concept in ancient Israelite society. It's recognized and even honored institution. The male kin of a murdered or violated person bore a social and moral responsibility to respond, not because vengeance is beautiful, but because the world without a standing judicial system needs some sort of action, not because vengeance is beautiful, but because it needed justice. So the family was the only institution capable of protecting its members and signaling to the world that violations would not go unanswered, and Simeon and Levi are operating within that framework. Second, Maimonides makes a surprising and important argument in the Mishneh Torah, and it says that the Noahide laws, he says, required Gentile communities to establish courts of justice and to prosecute crimes committed within their jurisdiction. And the men of Shechem knew what their prince had done. They knew he had raped a foreign woman, and they did nothing. In Maimonides' legal analysis, that failure to prosecute renders them complicit, in theory, liable to the death penalty under Noahide law. So this is a remarkable argument. Maimonides is essentially saying there's collective guilt is possible under certain conditions when a community knowingly shelters or ignores criminal conduct. The men of Shechem were not innocent bystanders. They were participants in the system that allowed their prince to violate a woman without consequence. Third is the gravity of the crime itself. The tradition holds that rape is among the gravest transgressions. One of the cases in the language says that where death is to be chosen over commission, if rape carries that weight, then perhaps a severe response is not disproportionate. Perhaps it's the only response that correctly names the magnitude of what was done. Now, there is a case against the brothers' actions. And first objection is collective punishment that comes up. Principle, we do not punish the many for the sins of one, is the foundational Jewish law. Simeon and Levi did not kill Shechem. They killed every man in the city, men who had no direct involvement in the rape, men who had, in good faith, undergone circumcision for what they should have believed to be sincere marriage negotiation. The tradition is firm. Individual culpability is the basis of individual punishment. But you cannot execute an entire city for the crimes of its prince. The second objection is proportionality. Measures for measure is the principle of proportionate response. One rape, however heinous, does not create grounds for the annihilation of the city. Nachmanides said that without equivocation, the brother's actions was a perversion of justice and not the expression of it. The punishment vastly exceeded the rigorous application of Noahide laws could justify. The third objection, and probably the most powerful, is Jacob's deathbed curse in Genesis 49. Jacob speaks his final words over each of his sons. He says Simeon and Levi, what he says about them is devastating. Simeon and Levi are a pair. Their weapons are tools of lawlessness. Cursed be their anger so fierce and their wrath so relentless. Jacob does not say, I understand why you did it, but your tactics are unwise. He says your anger was cursed. Your wrath was unjust, and he strips them of tribal inheritance. Simeon's tribe will be scattered, and Levi's will have no territory. And these are not symbolic slaps on the wrist. They are prophetic condemnations. So, been circling around two medieval giants of Jewish thought over and over. Now it's time to put them in direct conversation. Rambam, Maimonides, born in Cordoba in 1138, and Nachmanides Rambam, born in Gerona in 1194. Between them, they represent the two most powerful poles of medieval Jewish ethical reasoning on Genesis 34, and they disagree very profoundly. And we'll see the 5 different questions on the slide that they disagree. Why were the Shechemites guilty? For Maimonides, yes, they were. They failed to establish justice in their community. They knew about the rape and did nothing. Under Noahide law, the failure to persecute them itself is a capital offense. For Nachmanides, no, only Shechem committed the crime. The city's men did not rape Dinah. You cannot execute people for the crimes of their ruler. So was the massacre really justified? For one, partially. For the other, no. So what does the core ethical reasoning we have here? For Maimonides Rambam, communities that permit crime among them share the guilt. For Nachmanides Rambam, personal fury, however righteous seeming, cannot justify killing. So these two ethical variances have huge polar differences on how to ethically look at the rape of Dinah and the response that should have happened. So here we turn to the deception of circumcision, which is worth noting in the story. When I look at the top of the middle slide, we'll see mirmah, deceit, treachery. This is the narrator's own word, not the character assessment. The Torah begins by editorializing and the plan the brothers derive is treacherous, and we were told this before the massacre happens. So let's separate out some of the ethical issues here because there are four distinct problems and they're not the same. There's a false condition. The first problem is simplest. The brothers made an offer they never intended to honor: circumcise all your men, and we will intermarry with you. This was a lie. In Jewish ethics, the prohibition of sheker or falsehood is also among the most fundamental moral norms. Emet or truth is listed in Pirkei Avot as one of the three pillars from which the world stands. And the Torah commands in Exodus 23:7 that distance yourself from falsehood, so avoid lying. And the formulation is usually strong, unusually strong. And then there's the weaponization of using the Brit Milah. This is the second problem, is theologically far more serious. Brothers didn't just lie, they weaponized Brit Milah or circumcision. And this was the sign given to Abraham in Genesis 17 is an eternal covenant between God and his people. And it marks that as participating in the community of covenant faithfulness, to take that sign and to use it as a mechanism for incapacitating men so they could kill them is not just deceitful. It is in the language of the tradition a desecration of God's name. So Rabbi Samson Hirsch, writing in the 9th century, captured this precision where he says circumcision was meant to bring men into the covenant community. The brothers used to destroy those in the very process of entering that community, and the direction of the covenant meeting was reversed. So what does Pukua Nefesh apply here? Well, the Talmud recognizes three narrow exceptions to prohibition for the sake of peace, shalom, and modesty, and to protect the feeling of the bride. So a broader principle of protection of life can also override other prohibitions. So might the brothers argue that the deception was necessary to provide the family from ongoing threats from Shechem and his father? Rabbinical consensus says no. There are Talmudic exceptions that are narrow and very specific, and they do not extend to deception that enables the mass killing of people who are not the primary offenders. So Jacob's odd rule. And there is Jacob's rebuke, which, as we noted before, focuses entirely on the danger to his family rather than the moral wrong. And Nachmanides finds that troubling. The reader who is more worried about his own safety than the justice or injustice of his son's actions has revealed something important about his own moral priorities. So here it's worth looking at Dinah's voice. We'll see here on the left that Dinah went out. This is her last active verb in the chapter. Everything after this happened to her, around her, because of her, but not by her, and certainly not by her consent. Either in the act of rape or in the subsequent decisions about what to do, she goes out and then disappears from the moral narrative story. The brothers become the proxy. And I want to be careful here. There is a reading found in some contemporary scholarship that frames the brothers as acting as proxies for Dinah's own voice. And a patriarchal social structure, it goes, women could not themselves access legal or social redress for sexual violence, and the male kin were the mechanism through which the community acknowledged the wrong and responded to it. In that sense, the brothers' rage may have been expressed what Dinah could not express directly. Rachel Adler in 1998, the book Endangering Judaism, is clear-eyed about what's wrong with this reading, saying that the brothers, yes, defended Dinah's honor, but the honor is not Dinah. The honor is what the community projects onto Dinah. What Dinah herself felt needed is never asked, and the woman is normally defended, and not and the woman is nominally defended, and she is actually subordinated to what the brothers want, and the defense is conducted in the language of men's dignity, not the women's well-being. Then there are other readings from Frymer-Kensky argues that reading Genesis 34 ethically requires that we resist the pull of the narrative's own framing. Text pulls us towards the brother's question: should our sister be treated like a prostitute? It invites us to elevate the justice of the response. It does not pull us towards Dinah's experience. We have to resist that pull deliberately. We have to ask, what was she feeling? What did she want? What would justice look like to her and not her brothers? Judith Plaskow says in Standing Against Sinai, extends this into communal imperatives, saying if Jewish ethics is serious about human dignity, then it must build institutions and not interpretations. Communities must create structures in which women's voices, testimonies, and perspectives are primary focus, not the derivative focus. And the lesson of Dinah is not about Shechem. It's about every community that debates the best response to sexual violence without centering the person who is violated. So we bring a lot of theories here, and let's kind of bring it together. What you see in the slide is the architecture of the ethical debate. 6 principles, each of them foundational in Jewish moral thought, each of them pulling in a specific direction. We have human dignity. It says clearly that Dinah's violation demands a response, and that the men of Shechem who were slaughtered also possessed human dignity. We have the command to do not stand idly by. It condemns Jacob's silence. We have strict justice, gives the brothers moral force. The crime was serious, and the perpetrators deserve punishment. But punishment without mercy itself is a perversion of justice. And the tradition always holds that these two ideas, punishment and justice, in tension. Truth, met unambiguously, condemns the brother's deception. Exceptions to the prohibition of falsehood exist, but they are narrow. Using sacred ritual as a military trap exceeds any defensible exception. And then the concept of we don't punish the many for the sin of one is perhaps the clearest verdict the tradition can render on the massacre. Collective punishment of the innocent is unjust. The only complication in his Maimonides argument is that Shechemites' failure to administer justice made them collectively complicit. So after 2,000 years of commentary, scholars have staked out positions across the entire spectrum. On the left, there are those who primarily defend their brothers, finding that Maimonides' Noahide argument sufficient legal grounds, and others who read Jacob's rebuke as purely strategic rather than moral. In the middle, you find those who refuse a simple verdict, who see the narrative's ambiguity as intentional, and who treat the tension of the text as actual teaching. On the right, those who condemn their brother's action as an atrocity, Jacob's own deathbed curse, which Rabbi Hirsch and the majority of contemporary feminist scholarship say is a atrocity as well. I want to point out something about the structure of the spectrum. Position in the middle, the refusal to render a simple verdict is not an intellectual cowardice, it's not sitting on the fence. It is a claim that both the brothers' rage and their crime are real, and holding both the tension without collapsing into either is morally serious response. Rabbi Yosef Don Slavonchek, perhaps the greatest Orthodox thinker of the 20th century, occupies that middle ground space for modern thought, and that's where many people in the modernity will sit. So let's stay back for a moment and ask a larger question. Why does the Jewish tradition preserve all these disagreements? Why does the Talmud record minority opinions? And why does Maimonides include Nachmanides' objections even when he disagrees with them? And the answer is found in Pirkei Avot 5:7, teaching that a dispute which is considered for the sake of truth, not for the sake of winning, not for the sake of personal honor, but for the sake of finding what is right, is a dispute that endures and bears fruit. This is the model of the school of Shammai and the school of Hillel, who disagreed with almost everything, but whose disagreements are preserved together in Talmud. But these whose words are the words of the living true God. So these words are what bring us together for understanding. The 3 pillars you see in the bottom of the slide give you the framework for productive disagreement as truth-seeking and finding the words of God in truth and judgment. So I'd like to bring us to a conclusion, and we have 2 phrases on the dark background, and we own the 2 phrases because the lecture and in our discussion here has been, in a sense, an unpacking of what these phrases say. So we have 5 conclusions. Rape is a grave violation. The victim bears no culpability. Jacob's silence violated lo tamod. Community leaders, fathers, and princes and elders, they all bear a heightened responsibility for the protection of vulnerable people. And passive silence in the face of injustice is not neutrality, it's a choice. And the massacre violated the idea of the innocent is never justified. Killing innocents is never justified. So collective punishment of the innocent cannot be justified even by the gravity of the original crime, even by the legal sophistication of the Noahide laws. And then we also see that weaponizing the Brit Milah constitutes a misunderstanding of God. And the covenant exists break law to bring people into community, but not in order to take advantage of them and desecrate them. And then finally, Dinah's silence in the narrative is the most urgent ethical problem, not the brother's anger, not Jacob's fear. Dinah's silence is the most urgent ethical problem. Why don't we hear her voice? And Jewish ethics speaks so powerfully about the image of God in every person, about the obligation to not stand idly by while others person suffers, is called into this text to hear what it cannot hear, to recover what has been suppressed, and to center the person whose experience the narrative cannot bring itself to narrate. So Dinah's voice, her autonomy, it remains silent in the story. And the brothers ask the right question: should our sister be treated like a prostitute? Well, the Jewish ethical tradition itself, at its best, demands that we ask the question in a way that makes Dinah not her brother's honor, not Jacob's political calculations, not Shechem's desire, the subject of the sentence. So we should be asking this question: should our sister be treated like a prostitute? Uh, and um, in this, we should be looking at Dinah becoming the center of the question. The Torah leaves us the question unanswered, and that's up to us to identify and to come to terms with. Thank you for watching this short lecture, and I look forward to another engaging time with you in the future.